Good evening. Settle in with me for true strange moments from war and the long echo after war. These accounts come from service members, families, and the places that still hold their breath. I will tell them carefully, with respect, and without sensational detail. If the dark ever feels too close, pause and breathe, then come back when you are ready. If stories like this keep you company, stay with me to the end. Tonight we begin at a fence line in the desert, where routine falters and a voice answers in a human tone. I was the new patrolman on the wire that night. The desert was quiet, the way a held breath is quiet. The floodlights clicked and hummed, throwing pale lanes across sand and scrub. Out beyond the fence, the land kept its own counsel. In here, the gravel knew our names. Training says you learn the map first. Ranges, berms, the long arcs of road that pretend to be straight. But there are notes that never make the map. Places where the radio goes soft. Gates that rattle even when the wind is sleeping. A ditch that smells like old rain. They sent us out after final chow. Nothing special. Routine steps, routine checks. My partner told jokes to keep the dark from getting ideas. I laughed enough to keep him brave. The moon looked thin as a badge, and twice as tired. We turned along the perimeter, where warning signs hang like tired flags. On my right, the fence. On my left, the big empty. Somewhere south, a train mourned across miles of black. We stopped, listened, and moved again, because that is what you do when nothing is wrong, and that is the part that worries you. The first strange thing was the silence on the net. Not the dead kind, but the crawling kind. A thin insect hiss slid under the usual chatter and made the back of my head feel electric. I tapped the handset, checked the channel, checked the battery, checked my own pulse with my thumb. My partner grinned and asked if I was haunted already. I told him the set was having a small tantrum. He said the set had manners out here and only acted up when the land was awake. I asked what that meant. He shrugged, and the joke did not land. The far hills looked like ships run aground. A coyote cried somewhere we could not place. I heard a second voice under it, or thought I did, like a person imitating a whistle and getting the shape right, but not the soul. The hair on my forearms did a small parade. We came to the place where the fence makes a question mark around a wash. The sand held tracks I could not read. Rabbit, maybe. Boot, maybe. Something that preferred not to decide. I crouched and touched the print and felt heat still coming out of the ground. The hiss in my ear grew teeth. Words kept trying to form and then falling apart. A hello that stretched and thinned. A copy of a word I had not yet said. I knew better than to answer the air, so I stood up and made a small circle with my light and called it a field check. Every midnight, the generator hum shifted pitch. The lights flickered. For a second, the whole structure seemed to sigh. Then came the whispering, thin and close, a hiss that brushed the ear. No words, only vibration under the skin. Cole began to count. 3 nights, then silence, then again the next week. His partner told him to stop counting, said it made things worse. On the 4th night, something heavy hit the wall beside them. It was a trash bag, full of empty cans that had been sitting in the corner. It flew across the room on its own, scattering metal everywhere. Cole froze, his light trembling across the concrete as he tried to breathe. Sergeant Miles came running, found him pale and speechless, his eyes locked on the dark corner where the bag had been. From then on, no one wanted the midnight shift alone. They paired up, one watching the street through shattered windows, the other watching the empty hall bind. Still the noises came. Sometimes it was laughter, faint and high. Sometimes it was the soft shuffle of many feet moving together. When they looked, there was nothing, only the thin green glow of their night vision dancing over the ruins. The air carried a smell like burned plastic and iron, something that made their throats tighten. Around the third week, they decided to seal one room. No one went inside anymore. It was the same room Sergeant Miles had chased the boy into. Someone painted a cross on the door in black oil and taped a warning note. Do not enter. Still, at night, they heard knocking from inside. Slow 3 taps, then silence. Cole swore he heard a voice behind it once, a whisper shaped like his name. But when he called back, only the walls answered. They told themselves it was exhaustion, the heat, the isolation. But deep down, each man knew there was something else, something that owned that building long before they arrived. One night, Cole looked out the window toward the city. There was nothing but darkness and a faint red glow from the horizon. He whispered to no one in particular, "If these are the living quarters, then where are the dead?" Behind him came a laugh, not human, not loud, just enough to freeze the air around his neck. The wind that moved through the desert carried dust like smoke, settling over every tent, every Humvee, every man who tried to sleep beneath it. Out here near the Iran border, the nights were colder, quieter, more dangerous in their stillness. The soldiers called their post the edge of nowhere, a patch of gravel surrounded by wire and floodlights that never seemed bright enough. Each night, 2 men stood guard at the entry point, rifles ready, eyes searching the dark beyond the walls. It was there that the first sound came, the sound that would haunt every man who heard it. Private Harris had been talking with a local interpreter when he froze mid-sentence. A crunch of gravel came from just beyond the wall, deliberate, steady, like someone walking with care. He raised his flashlight, sweeping the beam across the empty road. Nothing. He listened again, the interpreter's eyes wide. The sound returned, closer now, a measured pace of unseen feet crossing the loose stones toward the Humvee, parked by the gate. They turned on the night vision scopes. There was nothing but the pale shimmer of dust. No movement, no heat signature, only sound. At first they joked about it. Maybe a stray dog, maybe the wind pushing small stones. But the sound came again the next night, and the night after that, always between 2 and 3 in the morning. The exact time when most soldiers found themselves fighting sleep and memories. Some began to say the gravel itself remembered. The interpreter, older than most of them, whispered a word none of them understood, something in Arabic that made the hairs on their necks stand up. He said there were things that walked without bodies, drawn to the places where blood once touched the earth. The region had been one of the deadliest during the long Iran-Iraq War. Even decades later, the sand still buried fragments of uniforms and broken helmets. When they dug shallow trenches for new wiring, they sometimes found bones, thin and white like chalk. The men would rebury them quickly, saying a prayer or muttering nothing at all. But after that, the footsteps came more often. They seemed to circle the perimeter, a slow walk around the living. One night, the sound stopped right beside the Humvee, where Harris stood. He held his breath. Then a whisper came, faint as wind, saying his name. He never told the others what he heard. Only the interpreter noticed his shaking hands. Later that night, the man explained that spirits could learn names when fear was strong enough. They used them like keys to open doors that should stay closed. Harris tried to laugh, but his voice cracked. The older man looked into the dark and crossed himself in silence. By the end of the week, the whole outfit had heard the gravel footsteps. Some claimed to see a faint shimmer moving through the dust, half-shaped like a man from the waist up. Others swore they felt a brush against their shoulders, as if someone walked right between them. No one could prove anything, yet no one dared patrol alone anymore. The commander ordered extra lighting, but even under white glare the sounds persisted. They began to think the lights only made it worse, that the unseen moved faster in brightness, its outline bending the air. Then came the night when the sound entered the camp. It began at the gate, crossed the gravel, and stood behind the radio tent. The sentry inside said he smelled something sharp, like burned hair and ozone. He stepped outside and saw the gravel moving as if pressed by invisible feet. The movement went past him, toward the far wall, then stopped. For a moment, he thought he saw a shadow detach itself from the wall and drift away. When he looked again, there was only sand, smooth and untouched. At dawn, the men found strange tracks along the perimeter. They were shallow, almost erased by wind, but unmistakably human. Bare feet. No stride pattern, no heel or toe. Just impressions where weight should have been. The interpreter refused to step near them. He told Harris that sometimes the desert remembers too much, and that memory itself can walk. The men burned incense they found in an abandoned building nearby, though none of them believed it would help. That night, the footsteps did not return. The camp stayed quiet, except for the usual radio chatter and the distant call to prayer drifting from a village beyond the dunes. Harris sat awake long after his shift ended, listening to the gravel under his boots. It stayed still, but he could not shake the feeling that it was waiting. The interpreter's words kept echoing in his head. Where the dead have no graves, the earth becomes their road. The road called Red Wings cut through the outskirts of Baghdad like a scar, long and narrow, lined with broken walls and scattered debris. The men who patrolled it knew every turn by heart, every ditch that could hide an improvised device, every shadow that might move when the wind blew. Among them was a soldier named Tyler, from Bravo Company, of the 101st Airborne. He had spent weeks rotating between static patrols and quick reaction shifts, sleeping in short bursts, eating when he could. By the time that night arrived, he was used to the silence that came around 3 in the morning, when even the dogs stopped barking. But what he saw that night was nothing he could have prepared for. His Humvee was the last in the convoy, engine idling softly as they backed into a narrow driveway that overlooked a stretch of scrub and block walls. He was manning the turret, scanning with his night vision, when a flicker of movement caught his eye. A shape stood near the wall about 30 yards away. At first he thought it was a child. It seemed to glow faintly, surrounded by a white haze like moonlight, trapped in dust. Tyler lifted his goggles to check with his bare eyes, but when he did, the figure vanished. He lowered them again, and there it was, still, watching. It looked like a boy around 12, head bowed, hands at his sides, completely still. There was something wrong with the way the light clung to him, as if the glow came from inside his skin. Tyler whispered to himself, maybe a trick of the lens, maybe a reflection from the wall. Then the boy looked up. Even through the night vision, Tyler could see the eyes, dark and deep and too calm. The boy smiled, slowly, and in that smile, something twisted. His face stretched and warped, the soft features melting into a grimace so inhuman that Tyler's breath caught. He raised his rifle, finger tense on the trigger. The boy tilted his head as if listening to him think, then began to move forward. First a walk, then a run, then a full sprint straight toward the Humvee. Tyler shouted, trying to warn the others. The headlights flared to life, flooding the road with blinding light. For a moment, he lost sight of the figure. When his vision cleared, the boy was gone. No dust, no sound, no trace. Just the pulse in Tyler's neck and the echo of his own breathing. The others asked what happened. He said nothing, only that he thought he saw someone near the wall. No one pressed him. They all knew better than to question what a man claimed to see at that hour. But that night, Tyler dreamed. The same boy, the same seal, running toward him through endless dark. 3 nights in a row, he woke with his heart racing, the taste of dust in his mouth. A few days later, Their convoy returned along the same route. The morning sun burned red over the horizon, and the city smelled of smoke and diesel. Tyler was scanning the right side of the road when he noticed a small group of people standing outside a gate. Among them was a young girl apart from the rest, her back against a wall, her dress fluttering in the dry wind. He turned his turret slightly. The girl lifted her face. Her eyes were black, not dark, but completely black, reflecting nothing. Tyler blinked. Behind her was a narrow canal, the wall casting a sharp shadow over it. There was nowhere for her to stand. She was hovering just above the ground. He felt the same cold wash through him as before. He looked away for a second, as the Humvee passed behind a tree. And when he turned back, she was gone. The others hadn't seen her. He didn't speak a word for the rest of the patrol. That night, sitting on his bunk, he tried to convince himself it was exhaustion, the heat, or just his imagination twisting shapes into monsters. But deep down, he knew what he had seen. And he wasn't the only one. Later that week, a man from his platoon mentioned seeing a child standing on the roadside, waving. When the convoy stopped to check, there was nothing but the smell of burned rubber and an empty ditch. The rumors spread like infection. Some said the road itself was haunted by those who died in explosions. Others whispered about spirits that mimicked the living. Tyler kept quiet, though the dreams continued. He started seeing the faces even when awake, reflections in the glass, shadows that vanished when he blinked. The black-eyed girl most of all, watching from the edge of vision, waiting for him to look long enough. He began to dread sleep. Every time his eyes closed, the glow of that boy returned, closer each time, whispering something he could never quite hear. By the end of the month, Tyler asked for reassignment. He never told command the real reason. The paperwork said combat stress, but the others who had been with him on that road knew. Some things, en route Red Wings, were not left behind. They followed. The desert outside Baghdad had its own silence, different from the city's silence, older and heavier. At midnight, the wind carried nothing but dust and the faint hum of engines. A convoy of 3 Humvees moved along a highway toward the capital. In the second truck sat a medic, a woman from the United States Army, heading home on emergency leave. Her eyes burned from sleepless nights, her hands trembled slightly each time the wheels hit a bump. It had been a hard year. She had patched wounds that never stopped bleeding, whispered comfort into ears that no longer heard. She wanted only to leave this place behind. But the desert had one more thing to show her. The lead vehicle suddenly braked hard. The tires screamed against the road, and the convoy jolted to a stop. Over the radio came a voice tight with fear. Something had crossed in front of them. The medic lifted her eyes from the floorboard and looked through the windshield. At first there was nothing. Then she saw it. A dark mass in the air above the sand, shaped like smoke, but too solid to be dust. It hovered, shifting color from black to green to a faint metallic blue, like oil burning on water. Someone in the turret whispered a curse. The medic felt the hair rise along her neck. The soldiers adjusted their night vision. The lenses flickered as they struggled to focus. The medic heard one of them whisper that it looked like wings, huge and slow, unfolding and folding again, as if trying to stay aloft. Then came the sound, a low groan that grew into a shriek, the kind that slides through bone and makes the stomach twist. A rock the size of a helmet flew out of the darkness and struck the side of the lead Humvee. The medic ducked instinctively, her hands covering her head. No one fired. They couldn't. The rules forbade shooting at anything they couldn't identify. Instead, the spotlight snapped on, its beam slicing through the night. In that light, the shape became clearer. It was not smoke. It was something with form, its surface rippling like heat haze, its outline bending the air around it. And just as quickly, It shot upward, vanishing into the sky with a final scream that left their radios hissing with static. For a moment, no one spoke. The desert fell silent again, too silent, as if the world itself was holding its breath. They resumed driving, slower this time. The medic kept her eyes fixed on the floor, afraid to look out the window. When they finally reached Baghdad hours later, her pulse was still racing. At the base, an Iraqi translator joined them for debriefing. When one of the sergeants described what they had seen, the translator frowned and said one word softly, almost with pity. Ait. The sergeant asked him to repeat it. He said again, Ait, a winged jinn. The word meant nothing to most of them, but the way he said it made everyone uneasy. That night the medic tried to sleep, but each time she closed her eyes, she saw that shape rising, its wings spreading across the stars. She dreamed of faces half hidden in the smoke, of voices calling from inside the wind. When she woke, her hands were clenched so tight, her nails had drawn thin red marks into her palms. She told herself it was fatigue. Fatigue, stress, the weight of too many nights without rest. Yet something inside her knew it was more. Weeks later, back in the States, the dreams followed her. She would wake to the sound of flapping wings against the window, only to find still air outside. Lights flickered when she entered a room. Once, while driving alone, she saw a shadow glide across the road in front of her car, silent and enormous. Her husband, also a veteran, listened quietly when she finally told him. Then his face turned pale. He had seen it too, years earlier, on the same road outside Radid. He had never spoken of it until now. They sat together in the dark, the hum of the refrigerator, the only sound between them. The medic whispered that maybe it followed her home. Her husband said maybe it never left any of them. That night, she dreamed again of the desert, and above the sand a vast shape wheeled silently in the moonlight, circling endlessly, waiting. The medic's house was small and quiet, tucked away on a suburban street where nothing ever seemed to happen. The war felt far, almost imaginary, until night came. Then the air grew heavy again, the way it had in the desert. The ceiling fan turned slowly above her bed, its blades whispering the same rhythm as the helicopter rotors she could still hear in her dreams. She had returned to the world of the living, but part of her was still out there, under that endless sand sky. It started with small things. The hallway light flickered each night at the same time. Doors creaked though no one moved. Her dog refused to enter the spare room, standing at the threshold with its fur raised. Sometimes, while she folded laundry, she would feel a rush of air behind her, cool and sharp, followed by a faint scent of burning oil. She told herself it was imagination, a mind tuned by war, to notice ghosts where none existed. But the feeling never left. It waited for her at the edge of every silence. Her husband had his own signs. He began waking at 3 a.m, convinced he heard gravel crunching outside the house. Once he went to check and saw nothing. Another night, as he looked through the window, a shadow passed across the streetlight, large and slow, with a shape that did not belong to any bird. He tried to tell her it was nothing, but his voice shook. They stopped speaking about it altogether, afraid that words might give it strength. Then came the sound of wings. Not loud, just the faint brush of air moving above them, as if something circled the roof. It happened on still nights, when no wind stirred the trees. She would lie awake, eyes fixed on the ceiling, waiting for the noise to stop. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it didn't. Once, she swore she heard a whisper just above her ear, the same foreign word the translator had spoken. IT. She sat up, heart pounding. The room perfectly still. The clock read 3:30. Days blurred together. She started keeping the curtains closed, turning off lights early. The smell of dust seemed to cling to her clothes, to the furniture, to her skin. A doctor said it was stress, trauma, the residue of what she had lived through. But no prescription could explain the footprints that appeared in the thin film of dust near the hallway door. Small, bare, leading nowhere. One evening, her husband came home late, his uniform still carrying the scent of machine oil. She was sitting in the dark living room, staring at the window. He asked what she was looking at. She said nothing. But he saw it too then, the faint reflection of two figures outside the glass. One small and glowing, the other taller, its outline shifting like smoke. When he turned on the light, they vanished, leaving only their own pale faces staring back at them. They decided to breathe. A new town, a new start, far from desert air and old memories. For a while the nights were quiet again. But after a few weeks, the same things returned. The knocking, the flicker, the whisper. Once more she smelled burning oil and sand in the wind. It didn't matter how far they went. Whatever had crossed that border with them was not bound by distance. In time she stopped being afraid. There was exhaustion instead, a dull acceptance that some memories have weight, and some ghosts follow not from outside, but from within. She began lighting a candle at dusk, not to banish anything, but to mark the line between day and night, between what she could see and what she could not. When the flame flickered, she would whisper a quiet thank you, unsure to whom she was speaking. Outside, in the dark sky above their quiet neighborhood, something passed across the moon, its wings silent, its shadow vast. The dog whimpered once, then lay still. The candle trembled, but did not go out. The interpreter was an older man named Farid. He had joined the American unit after his village was destroyed, and though his English was careful and formal, his eyes carried the same weariness the soldiers had. To them, he was a translator, a guide, a thin thread of understanding between two worlds that rarely met. But there were things he never translated, words he left hanging in the air, phrases that even he seemed afraid to repeat. The men joked that Farid knew too much. They were not wrong. At the outpost near the border, he kept mostly to himself, sleeping in a small tent beside the supply truck. When the night grew quiet, he would light a cigarette and whisper verses into the smoke. Some of the younger soldiers teased him, asking what kind of prayer it was. He smiled without answering. One evening Harris, the same man who had heard the footsteps in the gravel, sat beside him and asked directly. Farid exhaled slowly and said that prayers were not always for God. Some were for the dead, to remind them of their place. The men laughed, but Farid did not. He said the desert was full of voices, that the wind carried words from another time. The footsteps, he explained, were not ghosts. They were remnants, echoes left behind when the living and the dead walked the same ground too long. He told them the land beneath their camp had once been soaked with more than water, that the gravel had memory. Harris asked what he meant. Farid looked at him and said that sometimes the ground remembers those who fall upon it. It keeps their pattern, their fear, their last step. And if disturbed, it repeats it. The soldiers were quiet after that. None of them wanted to admit how often they had heard those steps circling the camp. But Farid's calm voice made it worse, as if he was describing the weather rather than something supernatural. Later that night, while the men slept, Harris woke to the sound again. Soft, steady, moving past his tent. He pulled aside the flap and saw Farid standing barefoot in the gravel, eyes closed, whispering. The air around him shimmered faintly, as if heat rose from the stones. Then the sound of footsteps joined his whisper, many of them, coming from nowhere. Harris wanted to call out, but couldn't. The footsteps stopped when Farid opened his eyes. The old man looked toward the dunes, then back at Harris. "They will not cross the line," he said quietly, and returned to his tent. In the morning, Harris found a thin circle drawn in the dust outside camp, marked with ashes and salt. Farid refused to explain it. Days later, during a patrol, the unit found an old bunker buried under sand. Inside were boxes of broken radios, cracked helmets, and bones wrapped in cloth. Farid stood in the doorway and refused to enter. He told them the bunker should stay closed, that its silence was earned. The lieutenant ordered him to translate some writing carved into the wall. Farid read it once, then twice, and shook his head. "It says they are still waiting," he murmured. That night, a storm hit the camp. The men huddled inside their vehicles, listening to the wind scrape against metal. Amid the noise came another sound, the soft rhythm of footsteps walking around the perimeter. Harris gripped his rifle but didn't move. He knew no one was outside. When the storm passed at dawn, they found the circle of salt broken. Farid was gone. They searched the dunes for hours, following faint tracks that vanished halfway to the horizon. Only his cigarette lighter was found, half buried in sand, still warm. The commander marked him missing, presumed dead. But Harris remembered what Farid had said, that prayers were not always for God, and that the dead could be reminded of their place. He wondered which side of that line Farid had been standing on when he spoke those words. The entrance to the bunker looked like a crack in the desert floor, a slit of darkness half swallowed by sand. The storm that had taken Farid had also uncovered it, tearing away years of dust until the steel door lay bare. No one wanted to go down there, but orders came from command. They needed to secure it, photograph it, make sure no enemy cache remained. Harris volunteered without thinking. Maybe he wanted answers. Maybe he just wanted to know if Farid was right. They pried the door open. The hinges screamed, and a rush of stale air rose from below. It smelled like rust oil and something else, old fire. The steps descended into shadow, slick with grit. The first chamber was small, lined with collapsed shelving and splintered crates. A torn flag hung from the ceiling. Its colors faded to gray. Harris swept his flashlight across the walls. Handprints, dozens of them, pressed into the concrete as if clawing for escape. Sergeant Miller muttered a curse. He said it looked like people had been trapped down here. The interpreter was gone, but his words hung heavy in every corner. The air felt charged, as if holding breath. Harris knelt by a crate, brushed away sand, and found a metal tag etched with dates from the Iran-Iraq War. Beneath it, something crumbled, ashes mixed with bone. He stood quickly, throat dry. Deeper inside, they found a second chamber, half collapsed. Someone had carved symbols into the floor, circles within circles, filled with black residue. The marks weren't military. They looked older. Miller said it could be enemy superstition. Harris wasn't so sure. He thought of the salt circle outside their camp, the one Farid had drawn. The shapes were similar, only larger, scorched into the concrete, as if by heat instead of hand. A low hum started. At first it sounded like air moving through broken vents. Then it grew, rising from the walls themselves. The soldiers froze, listening. The hum shifted into a vibration that pressed against their ribs. Lights flickered. Harris turned his beam toward the tunnel behind them. Dust moved in the air, swirling as if disturbed by invisible steps. Miller shouted for everyone to move out. They climbed fast, boots scraping on metal. The hum followed them, louder, closer. As Harris reached the surface, he felt a rush of cold air against his neck. Not from outside, but from below. He turned once. In the dark mouth of the bunker, a faint glow pulsed. White at first, then red, then gauzy. They sealed the door with sandbags and radioed command that the structure was unstable. That night, no one slept. The generator cut out twice. Each time, the same low vibration rolled through the cave. too deep to be wind. Harris stood awake, staring at the horizon where the storm clouds had been. He remembered the handprints, the ashes, the symbols. He wondered if Farid had known this place was there, if his prayers had been meant to keep it buried. At dawn, the commander ordered a new perimeter drawn around the site. Harris watched the bulldozer push sand over the entrance. As the door disappeared, a gust of wind swept past, carrying a faint whisper that sounded almost like words. The driver killed the engine and looked around. Everyone heard it. A single phrase in a voice that was not theirs. It came from under the sand. By noon the bunker was gone, the desert smooth again. The men packed their gear and left. None of them spoke on the drive back. The convoy moved through sunlight that felt too bright, the air thick with dust. Harris closed his eyes and saw the handprints again, reaching up through the darkness. He knew the sound would never hold them forever. Sooner or later, the desert would breathe again, and the bunker would open its mouth. The following week, the desert turned strange again. The wind shifted. The horizon shimmered in ways it never had before. The men spoke little, their eyes dull from lack of sleep. Even when they laughed, it came out thin, like air escaping a punctured tire. The outpost commander sent a 4-man patrol east to check a stretch of road where satellite images showed fresh tire tracks. Harris went with them. The sun was sharp, the air heavy with the smell of fuel. They drove in silence, engines growling against the emptiness. The road wound between low dunes and scattered ruins of concrete walls. A radio tower stood in the distance, rusted and bent. The convoy stopped near it to check coordinates. While the driver studied the map, Harris climbed out, scanning the area through his scope. Heat waves blurred everything. But beyond the tower, he thought he saw movement, something pale against the sand, like cloth fluttering. He blinked, and it was gone. They advanced slowly, dust rising around the wheels. At the base of the tower, they found the tracks they had been sent to follow. But the strange thing was how they ended. The tire marks led straight toward the dunes, then stopped as if the vehicles had simply vanished. No turn, no sign of burning, no debris. Just 4 parallel lines in the sand fading into nothing. Miller muttered that storms could erase tracks fast out here. But the air was still, and the sand untouched except for those lines. They spread out to search. Harris walked to a small ridge where the wind whispered through broken stones. The sound reminded him of the hum in the bunker. He knelt, brushing sand away, revealing metal beneath. It was the edge of a door, half buried. He called the others. But before anyone reached him, the radio crackled with static. Voices overlapped, faint and distorted, like multiple transmissions layered together. Among the noise, he heard a word repeated again and again. Farid. Then silence. The static broke suddenly with a sharp tone that made all of them flinch. Then came a sound none of them could explain. A chorus of breathing, slow and heavy, coming through every headset. It lasted only seconds before cutting out. When the noise died, the wind picked up, swirling sand into their faces. Harris shouted to fall back. They turned to leave, but the vehicles were gone. Only the prints of their boots remained. Panic broke the silence. Miller ran toward where the Humvees had been, stumbling through the soft ground. There was nothing, not even indentations from the tires. Harris called for command on the backup radio. No response. The frequency was dead. Behind him, the tower groaned as metal twisted under unseen pressure. One of the men swore he saw figures moving in the glare, outlines of people standing just beyond the heat waves. Harris looked, but there was only the shimmer of air. They started walking west, following the compass. After an hour, the horizon refused to change. The tower was still behind them, the same distance away. The sun began to sink. Shadows stretched across the sand like fingers. When darkness fell, they lit chem lights. The green glow felt thin, swallowed by distance. Then the footsteps came. At first they matched their pace, soft, following. Then they grew louder, circling. The men fired warning shots into the air. The echoes swallowed instantly. By dawn, only Harris remained. He woke on the edge of the outpost perimeter, lying half buried in sand. His rifle was gone, his gear stripped. The others were never found. The commander logged them as lost to the desert, presumed dead. Harris said nothing during the report. He knew they hadn't been taken by men or weather. Whatever had breathed through the radios had found them first. That night, as he sat alone, he heard the static again. Just a whisper this time, sliding through the headset. A voice that sounded almost human, saying one thing over and over, as if reminding him he had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. When Harris returned, the base looked smaller, quieter, as if the desert had leaned closer around it. He was thinner, his eyes red from sand and sleeplessness. The others avoided looking at him for too long. In war, violence is contagious. No one wanted to catch whatever had followed him back. The commander called him in to debrief, a small tent lit by one dim bulb, maps pinned to canvas walls. Harris stood there for an hour, trying to explain how 3 men in 2 vehicles had vanished into open ground. Every answer he gave sounded wrong. The desert had no shape for logic to fit inside. The report was filed that night. Coordinates, weather, visibility, all the usual boxes Abusi ticked. But when the commander returned to read it the next morning, the pages were gone. Not misplaced, gone. The folder sat empty on the table, its clips still closed. The clerk swore she had seen it there moments before. They searched everywhere, the desk, the radio station, even the trash burn pit. Nothing. Command demanded a rewrite. Harris sat in front of a blank form, staring at it for a long time before picking up the pen. The words came slow, uneven, as if the memory itself resisted being written. He finished before dawn, left the folder with the night sergeant, and went to sleep. When he woke, it was gone again. This time the sergeant was missing too. His bunk was empty, his rifle still leaning against the wall. The gate guard said no one had left camp. A search party combed the perimeter and found no tracks. The desert lay smooth as glass. The commander ordered every file in the tent sealed, every radio frequency reset. Harris began to wonder if the desert was erasing not only men, but proof that they had ever existed. The radio logs, the photographs, the notes all began to vanish one by one. Pages turned blank overnight, text fading as if soaked in invisible light. The tech officer blamed humidity, said the ink might have reacted to heat. But Harris had seen heat, and it never took words so cleanly. At night, he heard the static again. It came through the radio even when it was unplugged. Sometimes there were voices in it, familiar, half-remembered. He thought he heard Miller once, calling for help. His voice stretched and distant. He tried to record it, but the playback only produced silence. The medic back at the base told him to rest, said trauma could twist sound into meaning. He nodded, but in the quiet between breaths, he still heard them. Faint, calling from under layers of noise. One evening, the commander found Harris sitting outside the comms tent, staring at the horizon. The sun was red, sinking fast. "You think we're safe here?" Harris asked. The commander didn't answer. The wind shifted, bringing the smell of burned oil. When they turned toward the bunker site, a column of dust was rising where none should have been. The commander ordered everyone inside. The radios flared to life on their own, dials spinning. A single line of code repeated across every channel, a string of letters forming Fareed's name. By morning, the column of dust was gone. The desert lay smooth again, the air strangely cold. The commander walked to the radio tent and found the equipment silent, the screens black. Harris was gone. His bunk undisturbed, his dog tags left neatly on the pillow. The folder that held his third report sat on the table. Inside was only one page. The handwriting was his, but the ink was darker, almost burned into the paper. It said simply, "We never left the bunker." No one spoke of him again. The base was abandoned a month later after another storm buried half the tents. Years later, when new troops came through the area, they found fragments of a radio antenna and a stack of melted folders. Nothing else. Some say the desert took back what had been recorded. Some say it finally silenced what was never meant to be heard. The new unit arrived months later, unaware of what had happened before them. They came with clean uniforms, fresh orders, and the kind of confidence that only newcomers carried. The desert had already begun to reclaim the old outpost to host, swallowing tents and vehicles until only the radio mast remained. The soldiers rebuilt it, driving steel stakes into sand that felt too soft, too ready to give way. When the first night came, the air was still and heavy, as if holding back a storm. Private Dalton, the youngest of them, took first watch inside the communications tent. The equipment had been replaced. All new wiring and digital screens. Still, the static came through as soon as the generator started. He tried adjusting frequencies, but the hiss remained. When he turned the volume down, the static grew louder, as if mocking him. He leaned close to the speaker and froze. Beneath the noise, faint and rhythmic, came the sound of breathing. He stepped back, heart thudding, and told himself it was feedback. By midnight, the sound changed. Words formed out of the static, layered voices that rose and fell like wind through hollow metal. Dalton called for his partner, who listened for a while, then shrugged. "Old radio ghosts," he joked. But his laugh ended quickly. The voices shifted, now speaking in English. Not full sentences, just fragments. "Copy that. We're moving. Do you see it?" Phrases from some forgotten patrol. Then one voice cut through clearly, a whisper that made both men step back. It said Dalton's name. They killed the power and ran outside. The desert was silent again, the stars sharp above them. But when they looked toward the abandoned bunkers, they saw light flickering through the cracks. White flashes, brief and soundless, like camera bursts from underground. The lieutenant ordered a security sweep. The men advanced in a line, flashlights cutting through dust. The closer they came, the more they heard a low murmur, hundreds of voices speaking at once. Not screams, not shouts, just a steady flow of sound, as if a crowd were reciting something too old to understand. At the bunker entrance they stopped. The sand had caved in, leaving a narrow tunnel open. The light was coming from inside, pulsing faintly. The lieutenant called for a camera drone. As it descended, the audio feed filled with whispers, overlapping and uneven. The men watching the monitor saw shapes moving in the light silhouettes of people standing in a corridor, shoulder to shoulder, facing the camera. Then the screen went white. The drone feed died. The lieutenant ordered everyone back. But as they turned, one soldier froze, head tilted. He said he could still hear them, the voices, calling names. Each man's name in order, spoken slowly, clearly. He started repeating his own name under his breath, as if trying to drown it out. The others pulled him away, dragging him to the vehicles. By the time they reached camp, he had gone pale and stopped speaking entirely. Later that night, Dalton checked the audio recorder. The static was gone. Only silence remained for the first hour. Then a faint clicking started, 30 clicks, one every few seconds. He played it again. Each click matched a point on the map, tracing a path from the bunker to their camp. The final click was followed by a single word. whispered so softly it barely registered. Inside, Dalton deleted the file, but the words stayed with him. Before dawn, the communications tent lights flickered. The men sleeping nearby woke to the sound of someone talking inside. When they entered, no one was there, yet every radio was transmitting the same phrase on every channel. "We never left the bunker." The voices faded, replaced by breathing again, slow and deep. The lieutenant ordered all power shut down until sunrise. At first light, they found footprints leading from the radio tent to the buried bunker. Bare feet, small and light, like a child's. The sand shifted under the wind and erased them within minutes, as if the desert itself was tired of keeping secrets. The morning after the voices came through the radios, the desert lay still, flat as a mirror. The new unit moved about camp in silence, pretending nothing had happened. No one spoke of the whisper that had called each of their names. No one wanted to admit hearing it. The lieutenant sent a patrol west to test the signal range. Dalton stayed behind to monitor transmissions. The static was gone now, replaced by a low hum that sounded almost like the wind. He kept the volume low, yet somehow the sound filled the tent, vibrating through his ribs. Outside, the patrol vehicles crawled across the dunes. The men joked quietly at first, their laughter forced. But as they drove farther from camp, the radios began to cut in and out. A faint echo repeated every word they said, delayed by half a second. It wasn't feedback. The channel was clear. One of the soldiers, Vega, tapped his headset, cursing under his breath. Then a voice came through, repeating his name in a perfect copy of his own tone. He froze. The others heard it too. The echo began calling each of them, one after another. They turned the radios off, but the sound didn't stop. It continued from the speakers even without power. Back at camp, Dalton saw their coordinates blinking on the tracker. The dots began to drift apart, spreading like drops of ink on paper. He tried to raise them on the channel. No response, only that same hum, steady, patient, like breathing through the sand. Then, for a brief moment, the screen showed another signal, unknown origin. No call sign. Positioned exactly where the buried bunker used to be. By dusk, the patrol had not returned. The lieutenant ordered search teams, but the desert had already started to swallow their tracks. When night fell, the air turned electric. Sparks jumped between metal poles, and the ground gave off faint tremors. Dalton stepped outside and saw waves of heat shimmering across the dunes, though the temperature had dropped. The horizon flickered, as if the sky itself was exhaling light. He heard it then, the sound of sand moving without wind. A long, whispering sigh rolling across miles of emptiness. It carried voice, hundreds of them, low and overlapping. They seemed to be repeating the same phrase in different tongues. But one word kept rising through the noise: Farid. Dalton fell to his knees, pressing his hands against his ears. Still, the voices came from beneath him, from the ground. In the command tent, the lieutenant watched the monitors blink red. Every frequency spiked, each one broadcasting the same rhythmic pulse. He ordered the generators shut down, but the lights stayed on, glowing dimly from no source. The hum grew louder until the tent poles rattled. Someone shouted that the radios were melting. Then everything stopped. The sound, the light, the tremors, all in an instant. When they stepped outside, the desert looked untouched. The vehicles that had gone missing stood lined up neatly along the perimeter, their engines cold, doors open. No one was inside. The lieutenant climbed into one and found the keys still in the ignition. A fine layer of sand covered the seats, smooth as if poured by careful hands. Dalton walked to the nearest dune and stared into the dark. The wind had returned, soft and steady. It carried no whisper now, only silence. He whispered Farid's name once, testing it, and the sand shifted slightly beneath his boots. That was enough to make him stop. He turned back toward the camp lights, but they seemed farther away than they should have been. For a moment, he thought he saw a figure standing on the ridge, watching him. A thin man in desert robes, smoke curling around his shoulders. When Dalton blinked, the figure was gone. Only the faint trace of footprints remained on the slope, leading away into the vast plain where no one had walked. He stood there until dawn painted the sand pale gold, listening to the ground. The desert listened back. By the third day, the sand began to move as if alive. Dunes shifted against the wind, reshaping themselves overnight. The men at camp said it felt like sleeping on the back of something vast that kept turning in its sleep. Dalton kept watch over the monitors, tracking faint signals that came and went across the grid. Each pulse looked random until he began connecting the points. The pattern formed a spiral, centered exactly where the bunker had once been. He stared at it for hours, feeling the same cold weight in his chest that he had felt when the voices whispered his name. The lieutenant dismissed it as interference, an echo caused by old coordinates, looping through the system. But Dalton knew better. The signals were growing stronger, spreading outward each night like ripples from a stone dropped into water. He started marking them on a paper map, drawing careful circles with a pencil. When he finished, the shape resembled a fingerprint pressed into the desert. The thought made him nauseous. That night, a storm rolled in from the north, wind howling across the tents. The sand hit like rain. Dalton sat inside the communications tent, the canvas flapping so hard he thought it might tear. The radios crackled even with the power off. Between bursts of static came soft tones, rhythmic and steady. He realized they were coordinates, repeating in a pattern. He wrote them down, hands shaking. When he plotted them on the map, they pointed to a valley 10 miles away. The same valley where Harris's patrol had disappeared months before. At dawn, he begged the lieutenant to let him check it out. The officer agreed, sending a small team with him. They reached the valley by noon. It was wide and shallow, filled with broken concrete slabs and rusted shells of vehicles half buried in sand. The air smelled faintly of ozone. Dalton switched on his radio. The signal grew louder until it buzzed through his teeth. Then, all at once, it stopped. Silence. The team spread out to survey the site. One man called out that he'd found something, an old transmitter tower lying on its side. Its base was scorched black, but the cables still pulsed with a dim blue light. Dalton knelt beside it and touched the metal. A vibration ran up his arm. The radio on his shoulder flared to life. Static filled his ears, followed by a voice that froze him where he crouched. It was his own. The voice repeated the coordinates they had just followed. Then it said, "We never left." The others stared at him as his radio continued to speak in his tone, repeating his words seconds after he said them. The delay grew shorter until his voice and the echo overlapped perfectly, one inside the other. The lieutenant shouted to shut it down, but the switch wouldn't move. The hum rose until the ground itself began to tremble. Dalton backed away from the tower. Sand lifted around his boots as if stirred from beneath. Out of the dust came shapes, faint outlines of soldiers walking, their steps in perfect sync, each carrying equipment that shimmered in and out of sight. They passed through the team without slowing, faces empty, eyes blank. The lieutenant fired a flare. The figures dissolved like smoke. When the wind cleared, the tower was gone. Only a shallow pit remained. Dalton's radio hung silent at his side, its casing warm as if from use. He opened the battery panel and found it empty. Back at camp, the map lay on the table where he had left it. The spiral pattern had changed. The lines now formed a shape he couldn't mistake, an open mouth drawn in perfect symmetry, as if the desert had decided to speak. That night, he burned the map. But when the flames died, the ashes still held the pattern, faint but unbroken. He scattered them into the wind, hoping it would carry the sound away. Instead, the breeze shifted toward him, warm and whispering. It said his name once, clearly, and was gone. The valley stayed quiet after that, too quiet for the desert. No wind, no birds, no shifting sand. Dalton avoided looking toward it during patrols, but even from miles away, he could see a pale shimmer above the dunes, like heat rising from a road at noon. The others noticed it too, and called it the ghost light. Some said it was gas trapped under the sand. Others said it was the souls of the missing, walking in circles until dawn. None of them dared to approach. One night, the shimmer appeared closer. It hovered just beyond the perimeter fence, faint and pulsing. The guards called for Dalton because he had seen it first. He stood by the wire, watching the glow move slowly across the sand. It wasn't one light, but many small points, drifting together like a column of fireflies. They moved with rhythm, forming lines and shapes, almost like soldiers marching in formation. When the wind blew, the lights shifted and merged, creating the outline of figures. For a moment, he thought he saw helmets and rifles. Then the pattern broke apart, scattering into the dark. The next morning, they found tracks where the lights had been. Not footprints exactly, more like impressions burned into the sand. The marks shimmered faintly before fading under the sun. The lieutenant ordered everyone to stay clear of that area, but curiosity spread faster than fear. At night, men gathered quietly near the fence to watch. Sometimes the lights came close enough to cast reflections in their eyes. Some swore they heard voices mixed with the wind, distant commands, and the rustle of gear. Dalton tried to record the phenomenon using a thermal camera. The footage showed the lights moving in organized patterns, each pulse synchronized with a faint vibration, detected by the ground sensors. It was as if an invisible battalion was drilling beneath the desert floor. He showed the video to the lieutenant, who stared for a long time, before saying that some things should remain unreported. That night, the power failed again. The camp went dark, except for the glow rising from the dunes. The men stood outside, weapons ready though none dared to fire. The lights gathered, forming a rough circle a few hundred yards away. Inside it, a brighter column flared, tall and steady. Through the dust they saw shapes moving with it, figures dressed in uniforms from different decades, all facing the camp. The air filled with a low hum, deep enough to rattle the metal frames of the tents. Dalton whispered a prayer he barely remembered. The hum grew louder, then stopped. The lights collapsed inward, vanishing into the sand. A single flash followed, white and silent. When vision returned, the circle in the desert was gone, leaving only a patch of glassy ground where the sand had fused from heat. The lieutenant ordered the area sealed off. No one protested. But the next day, strange things began to happen. Weapons misfired without cause. Watches stopped at the same moment, 3:15 in the morning. Radios picked up faint Morse signals that translated to one repeated word. Home? Dalton couldn't sleep. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the same flash of light and the faces inside it, blank, but somehow aware, watching him. He began to wonder if the soldiers of light were not ghosts at all, but reflections of the living, echoes caught in time. Maybe they were what remained when men were erased from reports, when memories blurred and names were forgotten. The desert didn't take them. It remembered them differently. At sunset he walked alone to the perimeter. The ground there was cool and smooth, like glass. He knelt and pressed his palm against it. A faint pulse moved beneath his hand, steady as a heartbeat. He whispered to the desert that he understood now, that he knew they were not lost, only waiting to be remembered. When he stood, the light flared once more on the horizon, brighter than before, and then sank quietly back into the earth. That night the air changed. It felt thick, almost electric, the way the sky feels before a storm that never comes. The men moved slower, their voices hushed, their boots pressing into sand that seemed to shift beneath them. Dalton sat alone near the perimeter fence, unable to sleep. The glassy patch of ground still glimmered faintly in the moonlight. A thin veil stretched over whatever waited below. He could not stop thinking about the pulse he had felt under his hand, steady and alive. Around midnight, the first sound came. A single footstep, clear and heavy. Then another. They echoed from the direction of the dunes, deliberate and slow, too measured to be wind or shifting sand. The guards called out, their flashlights cutting across the empty desert. No movement. Still, the sound continued, growing into a steady rhythm, like a column of men marching in darkness. Dalton's throat tightened. It was the same cadence as soldiers used on patrol, precise and endless. The lieutenant ordered flares fired. The sky burst red, spilling light across the sand. For an instant, the ground shimmered and figures appeared, hundreds of them, translucent and pale, moving in formation. Their faces were hidden by helmets that caught no reflection. Their steps made no sound. The column stretched far into the horizon, vanishing into the dark like a river of ghosts. The men at the fence froze, unable to move or speak. Then the sound changed. The steps reversed, turning back toward the camp. The line of figures pivoted sharply as if commanded by an unseen voice. Their march quickened. The hum returned, low and building, vibrating through the ground. The lights flickered. Dalton shouted for everyone to fall back, but the air thickened, pressing against his chest. The sound of footsteps filled everything. Too close, too many. The first shape crossed the perimeter, passing straight through the wire without breaking it. The air bent around it, warping light. Dalton raised his weapon, but his arms felt weightless, unconnected. The figure passed by him. He felt no touch, only a sudden cold that sank into his bones. More followed, wave after wave, walking through tents, through vehicles, through men who stood frozen where they were. The whole camp drowned in the sound of steps, overlapping, unending. Inside the command tent, the radios turned on by themselves. Static roared, then cleared into faint transmissions. Voices called out coordinates, unit numbers, requests for backup. They were the same voices from the reports that had vanished, the same names long written off as missing. The lieutenant recognized one his own from years ago, calling a command he never gave. He dropped the headset and backed away, whispering that it was impossible. Outside, the air flared with pale light. The marching column stopped. One by one, the figures turned to face the living soldiers. For a moment, no one breathed. Then every radio, every headset, every speaker in camp spoke at once, all in the same calm tone. We never left. The lights blinked out. The footsteps stopped. The night fell silent. When dawn came, the camp stood untouched, but the sand around it was marked with thousands of prints. They circled the base and trailed off toward the horizon. The men moved carefully, speaking in whispers. No one could find where the footprints began. Dalton knelt beside one and brushed away the loose sand. The print was deep, perfectly shaped, filled with something dark that looked almost like glass. He realized then the desert wasn't keeping their ghosts. It was teaching them to walk again. Each echo, each shimmer, each whisper had been a rehearsal. Now they remembered the path. And somewhere beneath the dunes, the rest were still marching. That night, Dalton stayed awake listening. The wind was quiet, the stars bright. When he finally heard the first step return, faint and far away, he didn't move. He simply closed his eyes and whispered that he understood. The lieutenant had been a soldier most of his life. He had learned to trust maps, signals, and men who followed orders. But after the night of returning steps, maps meant nothing. Signals lied, and the men stared at him with eyes that no longer trusted light. The camp was quiet the next morning, unnaturally quiet. Even the generators seemed to hum lower, as if afraid to disturb whatever had passed through them. The prints in the sand had hardened overnight, thin shells of glass reflecting the sky. He gathered the men for roll call. Several names went unanswered. Dalton stood among them, pale and shaking, still hearing footsteps that no one else heard. The lieutenant wrote down every missing name, though he knew the list would mean nothing. Paper didn't hold truth here. Still, it was habit, and habit was all that kept him from breaking. By midday, the heat returned, bringing with it the distant shimmer of light along the dunes. The same valley that had swallowed the first patrol now looked calm, but the lieutenant could feel its pull. He ordered all electronics shut off, every antenna lowered. The men obeyed, their movements slow and wary. For a few hours the desert was still again. No hum, no whisper. He almost believed it was over. Then the radio crackled. No power, no signal, yet a voice came through, dry and clear. It was his own. The words were simple, an order he had given years ago during a failed operation near the Iranian border. "Hold your ground," the voice said. "No retreat." The lieutenant froze, unable to answer. The men looked at him, waiting for command, not realizing the voice on the radio wasn't his now, but his then. He reached for the switch, but the radio stayed alive. The voice repeated, louder. "Hold your ground." The air grew thick. The sound of marching returned, faint at first, then swelling until the sound trembled under their boots. The lieutenant stepped outside the tent. Across the desert, a line of figures was forming again, stretching from horizon to horizon. The soldiers of light were back, each one burning faintly from within, each face turned toward the camp. He felt something inside him give way, a mix of awe and terror. Dalton whispered that they should leave, that the desert wanted them gone. But the lieutenant shook his head. "If we run," he said quietly, "they'll follow." He ordered everyone to take defensive positions. It was madness, but in war, madness could sound like discipline. The men loaded their rifles, though they knew bullets meant nothing. The column of light drew closer, step by step, until it stopped just beyond the perimeter. The lieutenant raised his hand, a signal to hold fire. He could see them clearly now, their uniforms a patchwork of every conflict fought on that soil, their faces blank yet familiar. Some wore helmets marked with old insignia, some carried rifles from another century. And in the front row stood a man who looked exactly like him. Same height, same eyes, same line of jaw. The figure lifted a hand in perfect imitation of his salute. The radios came alive again, voices overlapping in every frequency. Orders, coordinates, names all blending into one continuous command. The men clutched their heads, trying to drown it out. The lieutenant stared at his mirror image and shouted the only order left to give. "Stand down." The word tore through the static, echoed once, then again, from every direction. The column halted. For a heartbeat, the desert held its breath. Then the lights dimmed, fading into the ground like water sinking into sand. The radios fell silent. The air cooled. Dalton dropped to his knees, shaking. The lieutenant lowered his arm slowly. Around him the men stood motionless, unsure if it was over, or if they had simply been forgotten by whatever had called them. That evening, he wrote his report in long, careful sentences. He described everything, the voice, the lights, the reflection of him alive. When he finished, he folded the paper and locked it inside a tin box. He told Dalton to bury it under the glassy ground, exactly where the lights had stood. "If someone finds this," he said, "tell them not to dig." At dawn, the camp was empty. Only the circle of glass remained, and beside it, a single set of footprints leading east, away from the rising sun. No one ever saw the lieutenant again. Some said he had gone to follow his reflection. Others believed he had finally obeyed his own last order. When the lieutenant disappeared, the camp began to dissolve, not in chaos, but in a slow, quiet unraveling. The men moved as if underwater, performing duties that no longer meant anything. Dalton kept the last order written on a scrap of paper in his pocket, folded and refolded until the ink blurred. The command said nothing about retreat, nothing about staying. It simply read, "Maintain silence." At first he thought it was symbolic, but the longer they stayed, the more he understood it as survival. The desert had gone still. Radios were silent, the hum gone, the footsteps erased. Yet at night, the silence felt too full, pressing against their eardrums until every man heard the shape of his own pulse. They spoke little, afraid that sound itself might draw something back. Even laughter, when it came, sounded brittle, breaking before it could rise. Dalton took the late watch every night. He sat near the edge of camp, where the sun beat the hardened glass, staring at the horizon where the lights had vanished. Sometimes faint flashes still flickered far away, as if the desert was exhaling memory. He wondered if the lieutenant was out there walking among them, his voice swallowed by wind. The thought didn't frighten him anymore. It felt almost peaceful. One morning he woke before dawn to find the camp half gone. Tents stood empty, gear stacked neatly outside, rifles lined in perfect rows. No footprints led away, no tire marks, just sand smooth as skin. He checked the mess hall, the radio tent, the vehicles. Nothing. Only his own tracks circled the base. For a long time, he believed it was a prank or a dream, but the silence told him otherwise. He gathered the remaining equipment and waited for the sun. When it rose, the desert turned white with glare. He heard a sound then, faint but clear, the rustle of paper. The tin box the lieutenant had buried lay half uncovered by wind. Dalton dug it out, his hands shaking. Inside was the rephrase, the handwriting precise and calm. But there was more now. Words added at the bottom in darker ink. They read, "The silence is not empty. It listens." He looked around, suddenly aware of how loud his breathing had become. He whispered a single word, testing it against the air. The echo returned almost instantly, a perfect copy of his voice. He closed the box, sealed it again, and set it back under the sand. From that moment on, he did not speak another word aloud. Days passed without time. He walked the perimeter, drank from the last canteen, and marked each sunrise by drawing lines in the dust. On the fourth day he found the glass circle cracked, thin fractures spreading outward like veins. Beneath it, something pulsed faintly, a light rhythm matching his heartbeat. He placed his hand on it and felt warmth. Not the heat of the sun, but body heat, living and deep. He pulled his hand away and backed off slowly. The pulse continued. That night, he dreamed of Farid, standing at the bunker entrance, whispering prayers into smoke. The interpreter looked older now, almost transparent. He said nothing, only pointed toward the horizon, where a single column of light flickered once, then faded. Dalton woke with tears on his face and sand in his mouth. The camp was gone again. Every trace swallowed. Only the tin box remained, resting on the cracked glass like an offering. He took the box and began walking east, toward the faint shimmer that marked the rising heat of another day. Each step echoed softly, not on the surface but beneath it, as if something walked beside him, matching his pace. He didn't turn to look. The silence around him was thick, but gentle, no longer hostile, no longer hollow. It was listening. And in that strange communion, he finally understood the lieutenant's last order. Silence was not surrender. It was acceptance. When the sun climbed high and the air began to waver, Dalton vanished into the glare. Only his footprints remained, circling once around the tin box before fading under the wind. The desert closed behind him, smooth and whole, its quiet restored. Weeks passed before another convoy arrived at the site. The new team came from the north, engineers assigned to dismantle the remaining structures and erase what was left of the base. To them it was routine work, one more forgotten outpost lost to sand and to time. The desert greeted them with silence, windless and white. They set up camp where the perimeter once stood, unaware that beneath their boots the ground still pulsed faintly, keeping rhythm with something no longer human. Captain Reeves led the unit. He was practical, steady, uninterested in superstition. When his men found the tin box, buried near the cracked glass, he brushed off the sand and ordered it opened. Inside lay a stack of papers, brittle and dark with age. The top sheet bore the title, Incident Report Delta. The ink faded but still legible. Reeves read aloud a few lines, descriptions of lights, voices, and the name of a lieutenant no one recognized. The men laughed uneasily. He folded the pages back and decided to archive them later. That night, as they powered up the new generator, one of the radios flickered on by itself. Reeves tapped the knob, thinking it shorted. But the static cleared, and a voice began to play. It was calm, measured, unmistakably human. "This is Delta Command. Coordinates confirmed. Maintain silence." The men exchanged glances. Reeves checked the channel, no signal. The frequency was dead, yet the voice continued, reciting words as if reading from a report. Subject: Echo manifestation. Recommendation: do not respond. The technician unplugged the radio. It kept speaking. The sound seemed to come not from the speaker, but from the air itself, resonating inside the metal shell. Reeves lifted it and set it outside the tent. The voice followed, growing fainter with distance. After a minute, it stopped. He told everyone to ignore it, to focus on work. But later that night, when the camp settled, the voice returned. This time every radio joined in, each one playing the same phrase in perfect unison. "We never left the bunker." Reeves recorded the phenomenon on a handheld device. When he played it back, there was no voice, only the hum of the generator. He tried again. The same result. Frustrated, he left the recorder running through the night. In the morning, he reviewed the file and found that it had kept recording for hours after the power was cut. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, a faint click began, repeating in intervals. Then came breathing, slow and deliberate, followed by the sound of pages turning. A voice whispered, "Report continuing." Then silence. They searched the camp for any sign of interference. The communications tent showed no damage. The radios were cold to the touch. Reeves sat down with the tin box again, turning through the pages. Near the bottom, he found a sheet he hadn't read before. It was written in a different hand, smaller and tighter. The first line made his pulse quicken. "The silence listens." He turned the page. The next line read, "Recording begins when acknowledged." The generator flickered once. The radios came alive all at once, louder this time. The voice that spoke was no longer calm. It sounded urgent, almost pleading. "Stop the transmission. Stop repeating." Reeves shouted for the men to cut power. Sparks burst from the cables, but the lights stayed on. Through the static, another voice emerged, overlapping the first, speaking his own name. "Captain Reeves. Continue the report." He stared at the box on the table. The papers inside shifted slightly, as if moved by breath. When the noise finally ceased, the camp was filled with a ringing quiet. Reeves gathered the documents, sealed them in a new case, and labeled it, "Do not open." But that night, long after everyone slept, a low whisper came from inside the case, turning pages on its own. The recorder on his desk activated without touch. It began speaking in his voice, repeating every word he had written earlier that day, even those he had never said aloud. By dawn, the men found the captain gone, his tent empty, his recorder still running. The last thing it captured was the sound of a chair scraping. Then his voice, distant, saying softly, "Acknowledged." After that came a new voice, cold and patient. "Record complete." After Reeves vanished, the cleanup crew refused to stay. They sealed the documents, packed the remaining gear, and drove north without waiting for new orders. Within a week, the desert reclaimed what they left behind. The wind filled their tracks, the tents collapsed, and the radio mast sank slowly until only its tip showed above the sand. A year later, a civilian research group arrived, studying geological anomalies in the region. They brought sensors, drones, and the certainty of people who believed in data, not ghosts. Dr. Miriam Shaw led the team. She had read the archived reports about disappearing patrols and static transmissions, but dismissed them as warty folklore. What caught her attention was the fused sand spread across several square miles, smooth and glassy, as if the desert had melted in precise circles. She called it a vitrification field. Under the microscope, the glass revealed patterns like fingerprints, spiraling lines that repeated in perfect symmetry. Her instruments picked up faint electrical pulses, rhythmic, almost organic. She logged it as residual static from past strikes. On the second night, the wind stopped completely. The temperature dropped without warning, and the camp lights flickered though power levels remained steady. Miriam was awake in her tent, reviewing drone footage. In one frame, she saw her own reflection in the glass surface, but something was wrong. The reflection blinked a second later than she did. She replayed the clip 3 times before shutting the screen. Outside, the desert gleamed under the moon like a frozen sea. At dawn, she and 2 researchers walked to the largest glass patch. It stretched for hundreds of feet, flawless and cold. Beneath the clear surface lay faint shadows that looked like footprints. Miriam knelt to photograph them, pressing her palm against the glass for balance. The ground vibrated under her skin, slow and deep like a heartbeat. The vibration continued even after she stepped back. The others felt it too, but said nothing. Later that day, their seismograph recorded a pulse repeating every 90 seconds, matching the rhythm of a human breath. Miriam stayed by the monitors until the pattern began to change. The intervals shortened, the frequency rising until the signal formed a steady hum. Then, without transition, it turned into sound. Not noise, but voices, hundreds of them layered together, whispering in tones that resembled language, but carried no words she knew. The equipment overloaded. Screens went black. The hum persisted in the air, vibrating through metal and bone. One of the researchers shouted that the signal wasn't coming from the machines, but from beneath the glass itself. Miriam ran outside. The ground shimmered, faint lights moving under the surface like veins of molten silver. In the center of the field, a shape began to rise, a column of translucent material, smooth as crystal. Inside it, she saw movement, a flicker of something human. She called for the others, but their voices drowned under the sound building from the earth. The column split open with a hiss of escaping heat, revealing an empty space shaped like a man. The surface rippled once, then solidified again. Where the figure had stood, the glass now reflected her perfectly, down to the frightened breath fogging against it. Her reflection tilted its head slightly, out of sync, then smiled. The sound stopped. The wind returned as if nothing had happened. When she looked again, the reflection was gone. The sensors showed no anomaly, no pulse, no residual energy. Only the recorder on her lap still glowed faintly. She pressed play. A voice filled the air, her own, calm and distant, describing the event she had just experienced, word for word. The recording ended with a sentence she had never spoken. The glass remembers us because we never stopped looking. She left the site that evening. The rest of the team followed. The report she submitted was brief, technical, missing every human detail. But she kept the recorder. Sometimes, when the world was quiet, she would hear faint tapping from inside it, as if someone were knocking gently from beneath the surface. Months after the research team abandoned the site, the desert fell into stillness again. Satellites passing overhead captured images of smooth glass patches that glowed faintly at night, yet no one could explain the cause. Storms avoided the area. Even the usual shifting dunes refused to form. It was as if the land itself was holding its breath. Then, one morning, the wind returned. It began as a whisper from the east, barely strong enough to move the sand. But by dusk, it had grown into a steady current, sweeping across the old outpost like a hand brushing dust from a forgotten surface. The sound was low, almost melodic. Nearby villages reported hearing what they described as singing in the wind, a deep resonance that carried through the night. Radio operators hundreds of miles away picked up faint interference patterns, too deliberate to be random. Some said it was Morse code. Others said it was a heartbeat. The first to return was a shepherd. He crossed the edge of the vitrified field, leading his goats carefully over the glassy ground. He said later that the animals moved silently, their hooves making no sound at all. When he stopped to rest, he heard a soft tapping beneath him, like fingers knocking from under the surface. He ran with it, leaving his flock behind. By the time he reached the nearest village, the wind had shifted again, rising to a mournful howl. In the city, a meteorological team began tracking the anomaly. The wind patterns formed perfect spirals, centered on the coordinates, once marked as the bunker. No dust storms, no temperature change, only motion. The air currents twisted inward, always inward, as if the desert were breathing in reverse. A young technician replayed the data and noticed faint spikes within the pattern. When converted to audio, the signal produced a human voice, repeating a single phrase, buried deep within the noise. We remember. At the same hour, hundreds of miles away, Dr. Miriam Shaw woke from a dream of glass breaking. She heard wind against her window, though the night outside was calm. On her desk, the recorder blinked to life, its light pulsing in time with her heartbeat. She pressed play, but there was no voice this time, only the sound of wind moving through empty corridors. Then, faintly, a man's voice whispered her name, not questioning, not calling, simply acknowledging. She turned the recorder off and sat motionless until morning. Back in the desert, the wind grew stronger, carving lines into the sand that mirrored the same spiral from Dalton's old map. Satellite images showed the formation expanding each night. The glass patches began to crack, releasing thin plumes of dust that rose and shimmered under the moon. Pilots flying overhead reported flashes of light beneath the surface, like lightning caught underwater. One crew swore they saw figures moving within the haze, walking slowly in circles, their outlines luminous and vital. By the fifth night, the wind reached hurricane speed, yet not a single grain of sand lifted. The movement was invisible, silent, except for the low hum that rolled across the desert. At its center, the cracked glass glowed white, and from its core came a column of swirling dust that stretched upward like a beacon. Observers later claimed it looked like a signal, a flare calling something back. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the wind stopped. The air fell heavy and still. When scientists arrived weeks later, the spiral was gone. The surface was smooth again, flawless and cold. But under the glass, faint trails of sand continued to shift, forming shapes that appeared and disappeared like words erased before they could be read. In one frame captured by a drone, the trails spelled something in English. It lasted only seconds before the wind brushed it away. The word was home. In the months that followed, Travelers through the region often paused when the breeze turned west. They ceased. The air there carried a voice, not loud but steady, like someone speaking through the fabric of distance. It told no story, gave no warning, only repeated itself in endless patience. We remember. Years later, when most of the old war sites had been reclaimed by sand and bureaucracy, a single building remained untouched on the outskirts of Baghdad. It was a former record depot for the Allied command, a concrete vault where thousands of field reports and personal logs were stored. Time had stripped the walls bare, but the shelves still stood, packed with folders whose pages had yellowed to the color of dust. The woman who worked there was known only as the archivist. Her real name had long been forgotten, even by herself. Each day she walked the rows of cabinets, cataloging what no one else wanted to remember. Most of the files were routine supply manifests, troop rotations, weather data. But in the locked section of the vault lay a small box, marked Echo Incidents. It contained fragments collected from the southern desert, melted tape reels, half-burned notebooks, and one recorder sealed in clear plastic. The archivist found it by accident, while searching for something else. On its label, faint letters spelled a name she recognized from rumor. Dalton. She carried the recorder to her desk and turned it over in her hands. The casing was cracked, the battery corroded, yet the indicator light still flickered weakly when she touched the button. Out of habit, she wrote its number in the register and placed it aside for later inspection. But that night, as she was locking the vault, she heard a faint click behind her. The recorder had turned on by itself. A low hum filled the room, steady and slow. She froze, thinking it was interference from the aging lights, until she realized the sound was forming patterns. Words emerged, peathed and deliberate. Record continuing, the voice said. Subject, Qualence. The accent was American, the tone calm, but the rhythm felt wrong, too even, too measured. She reached to turn it off, but the button did not move. The voice continued. Location unchanged. The wind has returned. She listened until the battery died. When the hum faded, the vault felt heavier, the air thick with dust. She made a note in the log audio anomaly, file pending review, and locked the recorder in a drawer. The next morning, the log entry was gone. The drawer was empty. In its place sat a sheet of paper written in tight, precise script. It read, The archive remembers. The incident should have been enough to make her leave, but curiosity kept her there. She began re-examining forgotten reports, testimonies of soldiers hearing voices, coordinates that appeared on every map, yet matched no known location. The deeper she read, the more she noticed a pattern. Every decade, every war that touched the desert, recorded the same symptoms: missing patrols, violent storms, glassy sand. The names changed, the nations changed, but the language of disappearance stayed identical. Late one night, she found a report filed by someone named Captain Reeves, classified long before her time. The document ended abruptly, mid-sentence, followed by a line of handwriting identical to the one that had appeared on her desk. Recording begins when acknowledged. Her breath caught. She whispered aloud, Acknowledged. The lights dimmed. The recorder in the drawer clicked back on, though its battery had been removed. From the speaker came a sound like distant wind, followed by a voice that was not Reeves's and not Dalton's, but her own. Archivist present, it said. Shadow report in progress. She stepped back, shaking, yet the words continued, describing her movements in real time. Every breath, every tremor, every thought she tried to hide. It ended with a sentence spoken in perfect sync with her lips. The archive listens. Then silence. She sat alone for hours, surrounded by shelves of forgotten history. Somewhere deep in the vault, Another drawer slid open by itself, releasing a draft of pulsed air. The smell of sand drifted through the room, faint but unmistakable. The archivist closed her eyes and whispered to the darkness that she would keep the record seal. The hum returned, soft and approving, as if the shadows themselves were turning pages. Outside, the wind began to rise again, sweeping through the broken windows, carrying whispers that scattered across the city like ash. The vault had always been silent, a place where forgotten things were allowed to be in peace. But after the night, the recorder spoke in her voice. The archivist began to notice small changes. Papers that she had filed neatly were now shifted a few inches to the left. Pens rolled across the desk on their own. And sometimes, when she walked between the shelves, she heard breathing, slow and steady, coming from behind the steel cabinets. She told herself it was her imagination, the air vents, the hum of old machinery. Yet when she stood still, the sound paused too, as if listening with her. Days became weeks. Outside, the city changed. Inside the vault, time dissolved. She worked longer hours, driven by the growing sense that the files were watching her, waiting for her to see something she had missed. Each night, she reviewed old reels from the war archives, recordings filled with static and coded chatter. One reel carried a faint echo of a man saying, "Hold your ground." Another whispered, "We remember." Every voice came from different years, different conflicts. Yet the tone was always the same, calm, patient, inevitable. One evening, the lights flickered and went out. Emergency bulbs glowed dim red. The air turned cool. The archivist reached for her flashlight, but froze when a whisper echoed from the far end of the room. It was her own name, spoken clearly. She called out, asking who was there. The voice answered in perfect imitation, repeating her words a second later. She moved toward the sound, her footsteps muffled on the concrete floor. The whisper followed her, keeping the same distance, matching every word she said. At the center of the vault stood the sealed chamber, the oldest section, built to withstand bombing raids. No one had entered it in days. She found herself standing before it, without remembering the walk. The heavy door was half open. Inside, the air was cold enough to make her breath visible. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with boxes unmarked by motif or number. The floor was covered in a thin layer of sand. In the middle stood a single desk, and on it a radio. It was an antique field model, wires frayed, its casing etched with corrosion. The dial glowed faintly, though no power ran to it. The archivist stepped closer. The radio crackled, releasing a whisper that filled the room like wind through a canyon. Voices overlapped. Female, young, each repeating fragments of reports, coordinates, confessions. Sector Delta maintained silence, acknowledged. Then beneath it all, a deeper tone spoke. Archivist present. She tried to step back, but the sound grew louder, surrounding her. The drawers in the shelves slid open, paper rustling as if an invisible hand turned every page at once. The radio flared with light, and from its speaker came a single phrase that cut through the noise. "Do you remember us?" The archivist wanted to answer, but her throat locked. The question repeated, softer each time, until it felt less like inquiry and more like invitation. When she finally whispered yes, the vault responded. The lights brightened, flooding the room in white. For a brief moment, she saw them figures, standing in the aisles, faces made of light and dust, their outlines wavering like reflections in glass. Some wore helmets, some uniforms, some the plain clothes of civilians. Each held a single page of paper that glowed from within. The pages drifted upward, dissolving into the air like solid. Then the lights snapped off. She awoke hours later on the floor. The vault was empty, the air warm again. The radio was silent, its glow gone. But the page she had been holding before entering the chamber was gone too. In its place lay a new sheet, freshly typed. It read, "The vault remembers because you answered." She left the chamber open after that. Every night the whispers returned, quieter, like sighs of relief. The archivist no longer feared them. She began to read aloud as she worked, her voice blending with theirs, adding to the chorus that filled the vault with something like peace. Outside, the city's power grid recorded faint transmissions around midnight, carrying her words across static to no known receiver. They said the same thing every night, in the same calm rhythm. We remember. We listen. We are not gone. It happened during the hottest week of the year, when the air outside the vault shimmered like liquid metal, and the city fell into power blackouts each afternoon. The archivist stayed inside, her only light the dim glow of emergency bulbs, and the endless pale hum of the radio that had not stopped since the night it awoke. It no longer frightened her. The voices had grown almost familiar, their murmurs a constant undercurrent to her cataloging. But one evening, the pattern changed. The static shifted, gathering into rhythm, then forming a voice she had never heard before. It was a man's voice, calm, deliberate, and very close. "Archivist," it said. "Do you copy?" She froze, the pencil in her hand hovering above the paper. For a long time she thought it was a recording playing from one of the old reels. But the tone was new, clearer, almost conversational. She leaned closer to the radio. "Who is this?" she asked. The static crackled. The voice answered instantly. "You have my reports." Her heart stuttered. "Your name?" A pause. Then softly, "Dalton." The radio hissed louder, waves of interference flooding the room. She turned the knob, trying to steady the signal. But every frequency carried the same sound, his breathing, slow and steady, as if he were standing right beside her. "You're not real," she whispered. The voice came back, steady as before. "Neither is silence." The next hour blurred into fragments. He spoke of the desert, of light that moved beneath glass, of wind that carried voices too heavy to die. Each sentence arrived half-finished, fading into static, before returning again from another channel. Sometimes she heard other voices behind his, a chorus repeating what he said with a delay. She wrote everything down, though her hand trembled. At one point he said, "We built this place so memory would not vanish. But it listens too well." When the transmission ended, she found herself staring at the recorder that had first spoken in her voice months ago. Its light flickered faintly, though it was still unplugged. She pressed play. The speaker released only a faint buzz, then his voice again, repeating her questions from earlier word for word. It was as if the recording had been made seconds before she played it. She did not sleep that night. Instead, she listened. At intervals, the voice returned, each time closer, no longer echoing through static, but emerging directly from the air around her. "Archivist," he whispered once, not from the radio, but from behind her chair. She turned sharply. No one stood there. But on the desk, her papers moved as though brushed by unseen fingers. By the third night, she began to answer him without hesitation. They spoke in short bursts, question and response, like operators separated by time rather than distance. She asked if he was dead. He said the word didn't fit anymore. She asked what he wanted. "To be remembered," he said. "To finish the report." His tone carried exhaustion, but also gratitude. The way a man sounds when someone finally listens. When dawn came, she found a stack of new pages beside the radio typed neatly, her own typewriter ribbon-nosed. The heading read, "Final Entry, Echo Sequence." The first line said, "Transmitting from within the archive." She flipped to the last page. It ended with a date, the current day. She ran her hand over the paper. It was warm. The lights flickered once, and the static rose again. This time it came from every speaker in the room, even those long broken. The man's voice spoke one last time. "If they ask where I am," he said, "tell them I'm home." The hum faded. The air settled. She turned the radio off, but the sound continued faintly, vibrating through the floor like a pulse. In the reflection of the steel cabinet beside her, she thought she saw movement, silhouette of a man standing just behind her shoulder. She did not turn. She simply whispered, "Acknowledged." When the next shift arrived the following morning, the vault was locked from the inside. The power was out, but a single radio light glowed through the window, pulsing softly in rhythm with the wind outside. When the maintenance team forced open the vault door, they expected the smell of decay, the stale air of a room long sealed. Instead, they found warmth. The lights were on, though the city grid remained down, and the air carried a faint vibration that made their teeth ache. The radio on the archivist's desk glowed with a steady pulse. One man called out her name, but the only answer came from the speaker's voice, repeating the question in perfect mimicry, a fraction of a second later. The team searched every aisle, every locked chamber, but she was nowhere. Her chair was still warm. The equipment registered no power source. The generator was disconnected, yet every machine hummed quietly, as if drawing energy from the air. The youngest technician, a man named Karim, approached the radio. Its dial flickered between frequencies, moving on its own, landing finally on a dead band. He leaned close. Static filled the room. Then a voice, calm and distant. "This is the archive," it said. Transmission continuing. Karim stepped back, his hands shaking. "Who is this?" he asked. The voice repeated his words slower, stretching the syllables until they no longer sounded human. The team recorded everything. For hours the signal shifted between tones, sometimes a deep hum, sometimes faint tapping like Morse. When they played back the recordings, the audio changed each time, new words appearing where there had been silence. One playback contained their own conversation from minutes before. Another carried whispers none of them recognized, listing names that weren't in any roster. By nightfall, the vibration grew stronger. The shelves rattled, papers lifting as if caught in invisible wind. Karim begged to shut everything down, but the supervisor refused, insisting on data. At exactly 3:17 in the morning, all equipment stopped. The lights dimmed to black, then flared white. From every speaker came the same voice, clear and unmistakable, the archivist. "Record continues," she said. "New listeners detected." The men froze. Her tone was steady, unhurried. "You have entered the vault of remembrance," she continued. "All who hear become witnesses." The supervisor tried to cut power, but the switches melted under his hands, soft as wax. The walls vibrated until the air itself shimmered. Karim shouted over the noise, asking what she wanted. Her reply came through every frequency at once, layered until the sound became almost music. To finish the transmission, one by one the machines burst into static, flooding the vault with light. Shadows moved along the walls, hundreds of them, shifting like film projected on smoke. The voices multiplied, merging with the static, each one speaking fragments of old reports. Coordinates confirmed. Maintain silence. The wind has returned. It built into a single word repeated endlessly. Acknowledged. When the noise stopped, the vault was dark again. The men were gone. Only the radios remained, glowing faintly. Security found the site empty the next morning, every device still powered, though no cables were connected. The recordings they recovered played nothing but a low hum. Yet when analyzed through spectrum filters, the sound formed patterns identical to human speech. The waveform spelled one phrase again and again. Transmission continuing. Weeks later, The same signal began appearing on civilian airbands, short bursts of static between broadcasts, each ending with a faint whisper. Amateur operators tried tracing its origin, but every attempt led back to random coordinates across the desert. Some claimed the signal carried their own voices, repeating words they hadn't yet spoken. One operator swore the transmission called him by name before the line went dead. Now, late at night, when the air is still and the wind moves through the city, radios sometimes come alive on their own. They hum softly, adjusting frequency as if searching for someone. Those who listen long enough hear a woman's calm voice reading what sounds like a report. She always ends the same way. Archive stable. New listener logged. Transmission continuing. And then, after a brief silence, a man's voice follows hers, distant but clear. Acknowledged. The signal did not fade, it spread. Within months, shortwave operators across the Middle East began reporting strange interruptions that overrode every broadcast. The pattern was always the same, a soft hum, a pause, then voices layered like wind over sand. The phenomenon became known among technicians as the whisper band. Government agencies tried to trace its origin, but each attempt ended in caution. The triangulated coordinates never stayed still. The source seemed to move, drifting like a migrating storm. In a communications station outside Basra, a night operator named Samir recorded the first clear transmission. It began at 3:13 a.m., when the radar went blank and the lights flickered. A low tone filled his headset, steady as a heartbeat. Then a woman spoke in English. Archive stable. Witnesses confirmed. Her voice was followed by static that rose and fell like breathing. Seconds later, a man's voice joined hers. Acknowledged. Samir froze. The phrase repeated 3 times before the feed cut. He replayed the recording, but each time, new words appeared, sentences that had not been there before. One playback said, "Maintain silence." Another whispered, "We remember the wind." By dawn, the file had corrupted, its metadata rewritten with numbers that matched no known code. Samir sent the data to headquarters, but when the file arrived, it contained only white noise. His supervisor accused him of tampering. 2 days later, Samir disappeared. The station log showed him clocked in at exactly 3:13, the same hour the first message came. Across the world, similar incidents multiplied. Maritime frequencies picked up faint voices calling out ship names that no longer existed. Pilots flying over the Iraqi desert heard calm operators reading weather reports from decades earlier. Amateur radio forums filled with stories of phantom broadcasts. Some listeners described hearing their own voices repeating words seconds after speaking them. Others claimed the signal bled through speakers even when equipment was off. A group of scientists from Ankara University attempted to study the phenomenon. They built an isolated receiver, deep underground, shielded from electromagnetic interference. For 72 hours, they recorded the whisper band, expecting random noise. Instead, they captured a transmission containing precise coordinates, each one corresponding to locations of old battlefields. When converted to sound waves, the pattern formed a slow rhythmic pulse, 4 beats, pause, 1 beat. The Morse translation spelled a single word: home. The government classified the data immediately. But rumors spread. Someone leaked a short clip online, a 4-second recording of the hum, followed by faint voices. The video vanished within hours, yet those who had played it claimed the sound stayed in their minds for days. One journalist wrote that she could hear whispers whenever the wind touched her windows. Another swore that when he played the clip backward, it repeated his name. Meanwhile, the desert where the first bunker had once stood remained quiet. Satellite scans showed no movement, yet every night a faint electromagnetic pulse emanated from beneath the glassy ground. The readings matched human brain frequencies in deep REM sleep. Scientists dismissed it as coincidence. Others said the desert was dreaming. By now, the signal had reached distant continents. Fishermen in the Pacific heard it in their radios. Arctic researchers picked it up beneath the aurora. The hum grew into a low chorus, threading through weather channels, emergency bands, even digital networks. The voices no longer spoke language. They murmured tone, rhythm, memory. People described it as hearing thought itself, ancient and patient, waiting to be acknowledged. On a quiet evening in a small apartment in Baghdad, an old radio left unplugged began to glow. From its cracked speaker came the sound of wind moving across miles of empty sand. Then, faintly, a voice whispered in English, calm and familiar. "This is the archive, transmission stable. New listener detected." A pause followed, soft as breath. Then the same man's voice that had haunted so many frequencies answered from nowhere. "Acknowledged." The signal continued through the night, pulsing softly like the world itself had found its frequency. Those who listened said the air seemed warmer afterward, the silence gentler, as if the dead had finally tuned in to the living and decided for now to stay. The desert no longer slept. From space it looked unchanged. Endless dunes stitched together by the shimmer of glass fields, yet sensors orbiting high above detected faint movement, a pulse beneath the surface repeating every 3 minutes. Scientists called it electromagnetic resonance. Locals said the land was breathing again. At night, travelers swore the dunes glowed softly, and those who stopped long enough heard whispers in the wind, as if the earth itself had begun to dream. In Baghdad, Miriam Shah couldn't escape the sound. Even hundreds of miles away, the hum returned every evening, faint but steady, resonating through her apartment walls. She had tried to ignore it, to live a life beyond the sand, but the desert had found her. When she listened closely, she could still make out fragments of the voices. Dalton, the lieutenant, the archivist, overlapping, calling, merging into a single rhythm that pulsed behind her heartbeat. It didn't frighten her anymore. It felt like remembering something she had never known. One night, she woke before dawn and saw her old recorder blinking. The device had been broken for years, kept on a shelf as a relic. Its light pulsed in slow intervals, matching the desert's rhythm. She pressed play. The hum filled the room, and within it came a man's voice, faint but clear. "The dream continues," it said. "We remember the silence." Miriam closed her eyes. The sound was not coming from the speaker anymore. It was in the walls, in the air, in her chest. She whispered back without thinking, "Acknowledged." The hum deepened, rolling like thunder from miles away. Her window trembled. Through the glass, she saw dust swirling above the city, forming spirals that shimmered with their own inner light. The shape was familiar, the same pattern she had mapped years before at the vitrification site, the spiral that marked the center of the storm. The lines moved slowly, turning inward, folding upon themselves until the city seemed to breathe. The hum steadied into a calm tone that felt like a heartbeat the size of the world. At the same time, across the desert, a research drone recorded an impossible phenomenon. The glass fields rippled like water, each reflection bending upward into columns of light. Inside those columns, shadows moved, figures marching, pausing, saluting. They glowed for several minutes before dissolving into the air, leaving only faint footprints etched in molten sand. The drone's last transmission captured a phrase that echoed across all frequency size: "Dream sequence stable." Back in her apartment, Miriam found herself standing in the center of the room, barefoot, surrounded by dust motes floating in still air. The hum softened to a whisper. She felt weightless, half asleep, half awake. The recorder on the shelf flickered once more. This time a woman's voice spoke her own, though older, slower. "The dream remembers us." The room darkened. She saw for an instant the Baghdad Mall, the bunker, the glowing dune saw layered on top of one another, places separated by time now folding into a single moment. Soldiers moved through her living room, their outlines made of light and sand. One of them turned toward her. It was Dalton, or what was left of him. He raised his hand, not in warning, but in greeting. Behind him, hundreds more appeared, faces calm, eyes bright with something like peace. The hum deepened into silence. When dawn broke, the city was quiet. The dust had settled, the sky a pale gold. On Miriam's desk lay a new page, typed neatly, in black ink. The heading read, "Desert Dream Log, Sequence 25. The final line said, "Archive integrated. Dream stable. Awaiting next listener." The recorder stopped blinking. She placed her hand on it and felt nothing but warmth. Outside, the wind moved softly through the streets, carrying with it a whisper too faint for most to hear. Those who caught it said it sounded like a lullaby, a single word repeated gently, endlessly. Home. The wind came early that morning, dry and steady, sweeping across the ruins where the old outpost once stood. Nothing remained but a hollow foundation and a thin crust of glass, smooth as frozen water. From above, it looked like an eye staring upward, unblinking. Travelers who passed nearby said they could feel a vibration in their chests as they crossed the basin, a hum that rose and fell with the rhythm of their breathing. Some left offerings on the edge of the site coins, sods, small photos of people who had never returned from war. The desert accepted everything. It never gave anything back. Among those travelers was a man named Omar, a radio enthusiast who had grown up hearing stories of the Whisper Band. He carried a small receiver built from spare parts, its antenna patched with copper wire. He had come not for ghosts, but for proof. Nights spent listening to static had taught him patience. He believed that somewhere in the noise, a voice waited for anyone willing to stay long enough to hear it. He arrived before sunset, set his tent beside the glass, and tuned the receiver to the lowest frequency. At first there was only the wind. Then faintly, a hum answered back. He adjusted the dial. The hum grew stronger. It pulsed slowly, steady as a heartbeat. He recorded it, smiling to himself, thinking it was the echo of underground resonance. But as night fell, the tone began to shift. Words emerged, soft and drawn out, spoken in English that carried no accent. "Listener detected," the voice said. "Archive online." Omar's fingers trembled. He whispered into the microphone, "Who are you?" The reply came instantly. "We are memory." The wind outside his tent rose, circling the camp like breath drawn around a flame. He asked again, "Where are you?" The voice paused before answering. "Here. Always here." The signal continued through the night, repeating fragments of old transmissions, coordinates, EFOMs, orders. Some were from conflicts he recognized. Others dated back to wars long erased from textbooks. As he listened, the frequencies began to layer, forming harmony. The voices spoke together, weaving phrases that felt more like thought than speech. He wrote them down as fast as he could. The dream breathes. The desert listens. Silence is not absence. Around midnight, the temperature dropped. His receiver flickered, then glowed with a pale white light. Through the static came a whisper unlike the rest, a woman's voice, calm and distant. "Omar," it said. "Do you hear us?" He froze. No one had used his name. "Yes," he answered. The voice softened. "Then you remember." The tent walls shifted as if brushed by wind, though outside, the air was still. The light from the receiver grew brighter, until it painted the sand with silver reflections. Shadows gathered around him, outlines of figures standing shoulder to shoulder, watching. He wanted to run, but something held him still. The voice spoke again, layered now with others behind it. Record continuing. New witnesses acknowledged. He felt warmth spread through the air. Not fire, but presence. The figures leaned closer. One reached out a hand made of dust and light, touching the receiver. The static faded, replaced by silence so complete it felt alive. Omar realized he was hearing their silence, the same stillness that had haunted the desert for decades. It was not emptiness, but memory waiting to be spoken. He whispered one last question. "What do you want from me?" The chorus answered together, calm and ardent. To listen. When dawn arrived, his camp was empty. The tent stood collapsed, the receiver resting in the center of the glass field, still glowing faintly. Passers-by later found the recording he had made. It contained hours of quiet, punctuated by a single word repeated again and again, each time softer, as if moving farther away. Listening. In the following weeks, the whisper band grew stronger, the hum spreading across new frequencies. Experts dismissed it as atmospheric anomaly, but those who had heard Omar's final tape disagreed. They said the voice had changed. It no longer sounded like one person, or even many. It sounded like the desert itself, awake and waiting. By late autumn, the desert's hum had crossed the horizon. Ships in the Persian Gulf began to hear it through their radios, a soft pulse that rode beneath ordinary transmissions, like a second heartbeat. At first, sailors thought it was interference from oil platforms or distant storms, but the sound persisted even in calm weather. It came strongest after midnight, a steady rhythm that repeated every few minutes, always preceded by a faint whisper. The ocean itself seemed to vibrate in answer. A British cargo vessel, the Halcyon Dawn, was the first to record the anomaly clearly. On November 5th, the crew captured a 30-second transmission on an open frequency, a voice calm and mechanical saying, "Sequence continuing." Listener confirmed. The captain dismissed it as some stray broadcast from the mainland. But when he played the file again the next morning, the words had changed. The voice now said, "Coordinates accepted. Dream expanding." That night, as the ship cut through still waters, the hum returned. It filled the cabins, resonating through metal bulkheads and into the men's bones. Radios flickered on without touch. Compasses trembled. The navigator swore he saw static forming symbols across his radar screen, circles within circles, identical to the spiral recorded in the desert years before. When he blinked, the image was gone. At 2:15 a.m., the lookout shouted. Lights glimmered on the horizon, dozens of them, arranged in a wide arc across the sea. They were not ships, not buoys. The lights hovered just above the water's surface, flickering in perfect rhythm with the hum. The captain ordered the engine sewed. The ocean fell silent, unnaturally quiet. Every radio on board came alive at once. From each speaker came the same phrase, spoken by overlapping voices both male and female. "We have crossed the shore." No one slept that night. Some prayed, others recorded, afraid to miss what felt like the end of something they could not name. The next morning the lights were gone, but the water where they had hovered glowed faintly under the sun, a sheen like glass stretching miles across. The captain sent the recordings to coastal authorities. By the time investigators arrived, the phenomenon had spread. Fishing boats reported hearing music under the waves, long notes that rose and fell like breathing. Divers claimed to feel vibration through their suits, as if the sea itself were speaking. Across the world, sonar arrays picked up identical pulses echoing from every ocean basin. Analysts traced them back to the same point in the Persian Gulf, but the source moved constantly, drifting east one day and west the next. When satellites finally captured an image, it showed only a thin ring of white foam, marking the water's surface, expanding outward in slow motion. Scientists called it a resonance bloom. To the few who remembered the stories from Iraq, it looked like something else, the desert dream finding a new body. In a coastal city, Miriam Shaw watched the news in silence. The sound from her broken recorder had changed pitch, matching the tone reported by the ships. When she opened her window, the wind carried that same vibration, faint but constant. Somewhere across the water, the hum grew louder. She thought of Dalton, of the voices that once called from under the sand. They had reached the sea now, carrying their memory like a tide. That evening, ships across the Gulf reported a brief transmission, overriding all frequencies. It lasted 12 seconds. The voice was unmistakably human, though no one could agree whether it was male or female. "We are awake," it said. "The current remembers." Then came a final whisper so soft it nearly vanished into static. "Next listener approaching." The transmission ended. The sea stilled. For the first time in months, the world's radios went quiet. But deep beneath the water, hydrophones continued to pick up faint echoes repeating in rhythm with the turning of the earth. Some swore the pulse matched a human heart. Others said it was older than that, the heartbeat of the planet itself, remembering every sound it had ever heard. By winter, the sea had begun to sing. Ships traveling through the Persian Gulf reported hearing human voices rising from beneath the waves, faint at first, then clearer as they moved closer to the center of the glassy bloom. They were not screams or cries for help, but calm recitations. Words stretched long and low, like prayer underwater. Fishermen stopped casting their nets. Divers refused to descend. The Coast Guard placed the area under restriction, though even their patrols returned uneasy, claiming they could still hear whispers through the hull long after leaving the site. The first underwater drone sent to investigate lasted 7 minutes before its feed cut. The footage it transmitted showed the seafloor shimmering like black glass, covered in thousands of indentations resembling footprints. Each print pulsed faintly, releasing small bubbles that rose toward the surface in perfect rhythm. The sound sensors picked up voices within the vibration, male, female, overlapping, repeating one phrase again and again. Acknowledged. Then the feed went dark. Weeks later, a second probe descended. This time the camera held longer. It captured shapes moving in the darkness, silhouettes, walking slowly across the seafloor, their outlines luminous, trailing faint trails of light. They moved in formation, their steps in sync with the pulse echoing through the water. When one figure turned toward the camera, its face was not flesh, but reflection, a perfect mirror of the operator watching from the ship above. The feed ended with a burst of static so loud it cracked the speakers. The world took notice. News stations played fragments of the recordings, though most were censored soon after. Scientists argued over natural explanations: volcanic gas, sonar illusions, deep-sea pressure harmonics. But those who listened carefully to the unused tapes heard something else, a rhythm inside the voices, a pattern matching human speech translated into pure tone. One researcher slowed the sound and found words hidden within the hum. Dream expanding. Memory complete. Along the coast, the sea began washing strange debris onto the beaches. Not wreckage, not plastic, but smooth, translucent fragments that glowed faintly at night. Under a microscope, they appeared to be fused sand, the same composition as the desert glass from the original bunker site. Yet these pieces pulsed with residual warmth, as if holding the memory of the voice that had shaped them. When exposed to sound, they vibrated softly, echoing faint whispers that no one could fully decipher. Miriam Shaw, now older, watched the reports in silence. She kept one of the fragments on her windowsill, a small shard shaped like a tear. Some nights, it glowed when the wind blew from the sea. The hum that had followed her for years changed tone again, deeper now, slower, like breathing. She knew the pattern. It was the same rhythm as before, the same dream continuing, only now through water instead of sand. She pressed her palm against the glass and whispered, "I hear you." Far out at sea, sensors picked up a brief surge in the resonance field. The pulse rose in intensity, then stabilized, spreading outward in all directions. Across the world, radio operators caught a single broadcast on every channel. It was not a warning, not a cry, but a statement delivered in hundreds of overlapping voices. Races. The ocean listens. The archive lives. Afterward, all frequencies went silent for exactly 60 seconds, as if the planet itself had paused to exhale. In those minutes of silence, sailors described seeing faint lights rising from the water, each shaped like a figure walking upward through the air before dissolving into the night. When it ended, the sea lay calm, its surface smooth as glass. The hum returned softer than before, almost tender, no longer reaching outward but inward, as if the ocean had drawn its dream bag beneath the waves. The world eventually moved on. But sometimes, when storms rolled across the Gulf and the wind aligned just right, people standing along the shore could hear the faintest echo carried through the mist. A whisper low and distant, repeating like an unfinished lullaby. "We are home." Months passed, and the sea grew still again. The bloom of glass that had once pulsed across the Gulf hardened into a perfect mirror, stretching miles under the sun. From the air, it looked like frozen lightning, a bright scar cutting across the blue water. Ships gave the area wide berth, and those who flew over said their instruments faltered whenever they crossed the reflection. It was as if the ocean had turned into a lens, focusing light inward, hiding something that waited far below. Marine biologists arrived to study the silence. The deeper they lowered their hydrophones, the quieter the sea became. Fish avoided the region entirely. The sonar returned no life, only faint echoes like footsteps fading down, an endless corridor. The pattern repeated at precise intervals, suggesting movement, though no shape appeared on the radar. It was a living absence, an emptiness that knew it was being watched. Miriam Shaw followed the news from her small apartment near the coast. Each night, she sat by the window, the old recorder on her lap, listening. The device had stopped glowing weeks before, but she kept it close out of habit. Then, one night, the red light blinked once more. The hum returned, faint and trembling, carrying a single tone that rose and fell like breath. She leaned forward and whispered, "Is it you?" The answer came in her own voice, soft and calm. "It's all of us." The next day, a deep-sea vessel sent by an international team descended through the glass field. At 400 meters, the water turned opaque, filled with suspended particles that shimmered in the light. The pilot reported a low vibration running through the hull. At 600 meters, they reached the edge of a vast plain of glass. It was smooth as ice and faintly luminous, stretching farther than the lights could reach. In the center stood a single column rising from the floor, hollow and translucent. The pilot maneuvered closer. Inside the column, shapes moved slow, human, drifting as though caught between waking and dream. The crew called for a sample extraction. The instant the drill touched the column, every instrument died. Surface control lost contact. The last transmission captured was a whisper that filled every headset simultaneously. "Do not disturb the silence." Then the feed cut. For 2 full minutes, the ocean went still. Not a ripple, not a sound. When communication returned, the vessel was gone. Only its tether remained, severed clean. In the following weeks, the reflection on the surface began to fade. The glassy field fractured, dissolving back into dark water. Sonar scans showed the plane beneath had collapsed. replaced by deep trenches that emitted low, rhythmic vibrations. The frequencies matched human alpha waves, the pattern of dreaming sleep. Scientists argued. Priests prayed. Governments silenced. The world had no category for a sleeping ocean. Miriam stood by her window every night, feeling the tide pulse through the glass beneath her feet. The recorder remained silent now, but sometimes she thought she could hear voices behind the rhythm of the surf, faint and unhurried, like men speaking in their sleep. One evening, as the wind shifted inland, she heard her name carried in the sound. It was not frightening. It was familiar, the tone of a friend calling from far away. She whispered back, "I'm still listening." Far below the waves, the ocean exhaled. The trenches glowed for a moment, faint lines of light, forming words too vast to read. Then darkness returned, heavy and complete. The hum quieted, the sea smoothed, and for the first time in years the air held no vibration, only the hush of completion. Those who had studied the anomaly said the silence marked the end of the sequence, that whatever intelligence had moved through the desert and the sea had finally rested. But sailors who crossed that water at night swore otherwise. They said the calm had weight, that beneath its stillness something waited, dreaming not of return, but of remembrance. And when they cut their engines and listened closely, they could still hear a voice far below, repeating one word over and over with infinite patience. Acknowledged. The sea was quiet at last. Not dead, not still, but calm in a way that felt earned, as if the planet itself had exhaled after holding its breath for too long. Across the coast, the glass that once shimmered under the sun had faded to dull sand, soft and cool beneath bare feet. There were no more transmissions, no more hum or static, only the slow rhythm of waves folding against the shore. The story that began in the desert had finally reached its end, dissolving into salt and silence. Miriam Shaw stood alone by the water, the old recorder resting in her hands. It had not spoken in months. The red light had gone dark, yet she could still feel a faint vibration through the metal, a warmth like the heartbeat of something asleep, but alive. The scientists had declared the phenomenon finished. Governments had stopped monitoring the frequencies. The world was ready to forget. But she couldn't. She had heard too much, seen too many pieces of the dream, stitched across sand and sea. Forgetting felt like betrayal. She walked along the beach until the tide reached her ankles. The water was cool, heavy with the scent of earth. For a long moment, she listened. Not for sound, but for the absence of it. The same silence that once haunted the vault, the bunker, the glass. It was there, vast and steady, no longer waiting to speak, but content simply to be heard. She realized then that the archive had never wanted witnesses or believers. It wanted acknowledgement, the simplest form of remembrance. She knelt and placed the recorder in the water. For an instant, nothing happened. Then the red light flickered once, a single pulse of life, before fading completely. The sea accepted it, drawing it gently beneath the surface until it was gone. A small circle of ripples spread outward, catching the light of the setting sun. The reflection looked almost like an eye closing. Behind her, the wind moved through the dunes, whispering faintly across the sand. She thought she heard voices in it. Harris, Fareed, Dalton, the lieutenant, the archivist, all merging into one calm tone. They were not calling for help anymore. They were thanking her, thanking anyone still listening. The sound drifted upward, blending with the wind until it became indistinguishable from the world itself. As night fell, the horizon glowed faintly, not from fire or storm, but from something quieter, a residue of light too gentle to frighten. Miriam sat on the shore, feeling the tide wash over her hands. The hum returned for a moment, deep and warm, like the memory of a song half remembered from childhood. It carried no words, only meaning. She closed her eyes and whispered the only answer that ever mattered. Acknowledged. The next morning, the beach was empty. Locals found no footprints near the water, only a patch of sand fused smooth and clear. When the sun rose, that glass reflected the entire scariest, turning the ocean's surface into a mirror. For a moment, it seemed the world had been made whole again. Everything above and below, united in a single reflection. Then the waves rolled in and erased it. The war that birthed the archive faded into history. The bunkers collapsed. The records deceased. The names turned to dust. Yet on certain nights, when the air is still and the stars tremble above the gulf, sailors swear they can hear a voice carried on. The wind soft, human, patient. It does not speak orders or warnings. It simply whispers one word, the last link between the living and the remembered. Home. The silence that follows is not empty. It listens,